What's going on, everybody? If you're new to this channel, my name is Quentin Stuckey, otherwise known as Stux. I make videos to do with narrative, psychology, philosophy, high sensitivity, personal development, among so many other topics. If you are new to this channel, please hit the like button below, click the bell icon, and be sure to subscribe. Do it. I know you want to. I'm not begging. This isn't begging. This is praying that you'll subscribe. Do it. I read the entire Roald Dahl 16 box set. I received it as a gift from my girlfriend for my 24th birthday, and I was really excited to read his complete work of children's literature. Well, almost complete. There's a couple of books that aren't included in the box set, but these are the major ones. These are the ones that are probably the most popular and the most acclaimed of his children's books. For those of you that aren't familiar with Roald Dahl, you are definitely familiar with some of his works. He's written such classic children's stories, and really just classic stories in general, such as Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, The BFG, Matilda, James and the Giant Peach, just to name a few. Those are probably his most popular ones and certainly his most acclaimed children's stories. But he has also written stories for adults. Probably the most famous one that I can think of off the top of my head would be Lamb to the Slaughter, which has been adapted into television numerous times. Probably the most famous adaptation, or at least the one that I'm the most familiar with, would be the adaptation in 1958, I believe, or 1957, one of those years, for Alfred Hitchcock Presents. I remember being in grade 9 English class and we read Lamb to the Slaughter, and I was double excited by that. I was excited that it was a Roald Dahl story that I had never encountered before. It was one that he had written for adults, and I was also excited because I was already familiar with the story because I had seen that famous episode of Alfred Hitchcock Presents with Barbara Bel Geddes killing her husband with a leg of lamb. So I read all 16 books in this set, including his 2 autobiographical books, Boy and Going Solo. And so today I'm going to talk about my top 5 Roald Dahl books from this selection, and then I'm going to mention some honorable mentions. So I'm going to give a brief synopsis, and then I'm going to talk about some of the themes, and then I'm going to give just a basic rating and opinion on this book and why I chose it for my top 5. Most of these books, I either read them as a child and then I encountered them again at the age of 24, or I have recently discovered them and I decided to put them on my top 5. But I would say that 90% of them were Roald Dahl books that I was already familiar with, and so maybe part of the reason why I enjoy them so much is because of that nostalgic value. But it was really interesting to read his children's stories from the perspective of a 24-year-old versus the perspective of a 6, 7, or 8-year-old, however old I was when I first read them. But I don't know if I've mentioned in past videos, Roald Dahl was one of the first writers that I ever encountered. He was one of the first writers that really got me obsessed with narratives and with stories. I remember having these books read to me by my parents, by family members, by teachers at school. I loved his stories, and I still love them to this day. And I also love the illustrations by Quentin Blake. That was actually one of the reasons that I became really interested in Roald Dahl as a child, was because Quentin Blake was his primary illustrator, and obviously my first name is Quentin, so it's pretty obvious why I would be super into that, because it's very rare then and now to come across something that has my name on it, because Quentin, I mean, it's really Quentin, Quentin, is such a unique name. Hopefully it stays that way. Hopefully Quentin doesn't become popular overnight, because then it won't be as unique. But enough yakking. Let's get into some Roald Dahl. Number 5, The Magic Finger. A young girl possesses a unique power. Whenever she becomes angry, she uses her finger to turn wrongdoers into animals or other oddities. She uses her magic finger upon the Gregg family, who relish the sport of hunting, turning them into a flock of birds. The Greggs end up getting hunted by a family of ducks who try to shoot at them, take over their home, and even take their phone calls. This experience prompts the family to never hunt a living bird again, changing their last name to Egg and taking care of the birds in and around their farm. The girl, who remains unnamed throughout the story, has taught them a lesson about animal welfare, all through her magic finger. Some major themes running throughout the story include animal rights, classic Dahlian theme, if that's even a word. I'm not sure if other scholars use the term Dahlian, but whatever, I'm coining it if it hasn't been coined yet. The classic Dahlian theme of revenge against cruelty, the ingenuity of young people, and most importantly of all to the story, the use of magic. So the theme of animal rights can most clearly be seen in the girls' outrage at the Gregg family for taking up the sport of hunting, in particular the Gregg boys who really relish the sport. And it's interesting that in some books, Roald Dahl presents animals as commodities, and he seems to advocate the sport of hunting, for example in Danny the Champion of the World with the pheasant hunting. But in other books, he paints animals in a more positive light and has animals as the central characters to his stories. And it's really interesting that you have such a mix of animals as commodities on one side, you have that viewpoint, and then animals as having the same rights and ingenuity and intelligence as human beings. So it's quite an interesting mix. But in this one in particular, I think Roald Dahl is really on the side of viewing hunting as barbaric and something that shouldn't be taken up as a sport by inflicting harm onto sentient beings. And then of course, the theme of revenge against cruelty can clearly be seen in the girl's outrage prompting her to utilize her magic finger and turn the Gregg family into ducks to give them a taste of their own medicine, an eye for an eye, if you will. So she's trying to get revenge on them by basically being cruel and having them experience what animals experience when they are hunted by the Gregg family. So in this case, the hunter becomes the hunted. The ingenuity of young people can also clearly be seen in the girl's use of her magic finger. Even though she can't always control it, it's often motivated by anger. Nonetheless, it is still a representation of the theme of the ingenuity of young people. And then finally, the use of magic is evident throughout most of Roald Dahl's children's stories. The only one that's really not very magical is Danny the Champion of the World. But in this one, magic is quite literally in the title. The girl possesses a magic finger that is able to right wrongs that she sees, or to inflict cruelty in order to right wrongs. Overall, I would rate this book a 4 out of 5. This is actually a very underrated Roald Dahl children's story. I have this distinct memory of listening to it on audiobook and absolutely loving it. It's actually the shortest book in the box set. I think it's only about 30 or 40 pages. I think I finished it in about 25 minutes to half an hour. It's very simple to read, and it's a very good story with a very important moral lesson. And even if you don't necessarily agree that it's wrong to eat animals or to hunt animals, it at least gives you something to think about, another perspective to consider, all through the lens of Roald Dahl. Number 4, Matilda. A very young, prodigious, intelligent girl named Matilda is born into a family that is incapable of understanding her love of reading, learning, and most of all, her telekinetic powers. She begins school at Cruncham Hall and befriends her teacher, Miss Honey, who sees the enormous mental capacity Matilda has for her young age. Using her telekinetic powers, Matilda defeats Agatha Trunchbull, the abusive, malevolent, extreme headmistress, and lives the rest of her life away from her ill-fitted family and with her teacher, Miss Honey. The major themes running throughout this book are the value of young intelligence, revenge against cruelty, extreme cruelty in this case, the ingenuity of young people, and of course, magic. So the value of young intelligence can clearly be seen in the beginning with Matilda being so precocious, with wanting to read, wanting to learn, her parents refusing to get her a book, and so Matilda has the idea of going to the library every day and sitting in the library for all hours of the day because her parents leave her alone throughout the day for some strange reason. Very neglectful parents, and she consumes every single book that she can possibly get her hands on. So the value of young intelligence is obviously celebrated in this book. And really this book is about a very intelligent person, so intelligent that she possesses magic powers. Revenge against cruelty, or extreme cruelty in this case, can clearly be seen in Matilda trying to defeat the Trunchbull, as she was referred to in the book, the headmistress at Cruncham Hall, who is extremely abusive, extremely malevolent, and there's one famous scene, not only in the book but also in the movie, where the Trunchbull grabs a girl by the pigtails and swings her around like a javelin and throws her over the fence of the schoolyard. Cruel, cruel things like that. She picks up a boy, throws him out the window, she slams a plate over the head of Bruce Bogtrotter after he's finished his big, huge chocolate cake. There's obviously extreme cruelty towards children, and Matilda gets revenge by utilizing her intellectual and her telekinetic abilities to not physically harm the Trunchbull like the Trunchbull has been doing all throughout the book, but through emotional and psychological manipulation. The ingenuity of young people is obviously clearly demonstrated through the character of Matilda. She is smarter than any of the other peers that she comes across, and in some cases, she's smarter than any of the other adults that she comes across. And finally, magic. This is clearly demonstrated in Matilda's telekinetic powers, her ability to tip a glass over, her ability to write on a chalkboard, all sorts of other examples, and her ability to harness this magic to do good. Her ability to control it is something that wasn't so much seen in the last book, The Magic Finger, with the girl unable to control it. In this case, Matilda has the brain power and the capacity to control her telekinetic abilities, and that's quite magical. I would rate this book a 5 out of 5. This is one of my all-time favorite Roald Dahl stories. The movie by Danny DeVito is also a really well-done film that stays pretty faithful to the book. It doesn't change too much. I think this book is also really popular with young people because it really celebrates being young and being intelligent and having the capacity to act in the adult world and to basically not take any shit from anyone, especially adults. And I think that it also encourages the adoption of a different ideology that views children not as innocent little creatures that don't have any intelligence and don't know a thing about the world, but as people who possess a certain amount of intelligence. And maybe it's underdeveloped, although in this case with Matilda it's overdeveloped, you could say. But I think that it really encourages readers, especially adult readers, to look at children as not just children, but as functioning human beings that can possess a certain amount of intelligence and ingenuity. Number 3, Fantastic Mr. Fox. Daring, confident, and slightly eccentric Mr. Fox steals food, beverages, and other nourishment from an above-ground farm owned by 3 farmers, Bogus, Bunce, and Bean. Fox, along with the moles, the badgers, the weasels, and the rabbits, help him on his quest to feed the lower ground inhabitants by stealing from the farmers. The 3 farmers attempt to catch the Fox family by digging underground to find their home, only to be continually outsmarted by Fantastic Mr. Fox. In fact, the 3 farmers are left waiting in the cold rain at the end of the story for Fox to come out from hiding, but it looks like they'll be waiting a long time. The major themes running throughout this book include class division, ingenuity, human cruelty towards animals, and an eccentric/daring protagonist. Class division is clearly seen just by virtue of the setting and the characters. You have the foxes and other animals living below ground, and you have the farmers living on the above ground. So you have the lower classes who don't have access to resources that are necessary to keep themselves alive. Then you have the farmers and the upper classes who are the ones that are producing the resources and hoarding all the resources for themselves. So there's a clear class division there. And there's also a bit of a Robin Hood tale in that Robin Hood was the hero who stole from the rich and gave to the poor. In some ways, Mr. Fox is sort of a Robin Hood, but he is initially doing it just for his family. He's not necessarily doing it right away for the other inhabitants underground. It's not until later on in the story that he decides to do that. Ingenuity is obviously another theme running throughout this book. Mr. Fox has all kinds of interesting plans and interesting executions of these plans, so he's quite ingenious and quite intelligent when it comes to tricking these farmers and always keeping one step ahead of them in order to provide for his family. There's also the theme of human cruelty towards animals, which is a similar theme as found in The Magic Finger, although I don't really know if I mentioned that theme. That is also a present theme in The Magic Finger, is obviously human cruelty towards animals. You have the 3 farmers continually digging and using all kinds of different equipment to try and get the foxes, and obviously they don't care about the animals that they harm underneath, and they don't really care about any animals that they harm by virtue of them being farmers and treating animals as commodities. And then finally you have the eccentric, daring protagonist, which is obviously Mr. Fox. All throughout the book he is energized, he has all kinds of plans, he's extremely confident, he's extremely comical, and I think that there are moments in the book where he's almost overconfident, and a clear demonstration of his overconfidence sort of playing against him is when he loses his tail, which is obviously a metaphor for his character being knocked down a couple of pegs. It's a metaphor for his greatest flaw, which might be his overconfidence in his ability to swipe all these items from these 3 farmers. Overall, I would rate the book a 4 out of 5. This is another book that I believe was read to me at some point. The story was pretty familiar when I was reading it, but it also felt like I was reading it for the first time, and I really, really enjoyed it. I think that this has become one of my favorite Roald Dahl stories. It's very funny, it's extremely heartwarming, and the illustrations by Quentin Blake really bring it all together as well. Number 2, The Witches. While on holiday with his grandmother, a young boy stumbles upon an English sect of witches who plan to turn all children into mice for the purpose of murder. Genocide, basically. The witches turn him and another young boy, Bruno, into mice, yet they still manage to enlist the help of the grandmother in defeating this group of witches by sneaking their secret mouse formula in their food, turning all the witches, especially the Grand High Witch, into mice themselves. The boy remains a mouse for the rest of his life as him and his grandmother dedicate themselves to finding the remaining evil witches of the world and thwarting their evil plans. Some major themes running throughout this book include revenge against cruelty, ingenuity of young people, magic, and misogyny, apparently. The revenge against cruelty is obviously clearly demonstrated when the young boy, who remains nameless throughout the book for some reason, when the young boy, despite his transformation into a mouse, decides to enlist the help of his grandmother in order to punish the witches for their cruelty towards children, their current cruelty and their planned cruelty towards children, before they can execute their plan to turn all these children into mice. And the second theme, ingenuity of young people, is also related to the theme of revenge against cruelty, because, as I stated, the boy has the idea of inflicting the plans that the witches had for children of England onto the witches themselves. So he comes up with the idea of turning them into mice by using their own poison against them. And of course we have the theme of magic, which is evident just in the mere existence of witches, although a lot of people will debate that. People do believe that witches do exist, and maybe they do, but Roald Dahl's witches, they are certainly magical. They possess all these other worldly powers. They're able to turn children into mice. They're able to put children into paintings. They're able to do all these diabolical things. So they're certainly evil witches, but they are magical nonetheless. And finally, the final theme, misogyny, is one that people talk about a lot in relation to this book. I'm not sure that I totally agree with that reading, but I can certainly understand why some scholars and readers would come to that conclusion and obtain that reading from this text. Most of the female characters in this book are portrayed as evil and sinister and diabolical. The only really redeeming female character in the book is the grandmother, but other than that, I can't really put my finger on anything specifically that makes this a misogynistic book, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Let me know what you think in the comments, but that's certainly a theme that I think, if you dig deep enough, could be there, but you could also say that about all kinds of different books. But I think that in this case, I think it's a bit far-fetched, but again, maybe I'm wrong about that. Leave a comment below if you think that Roald Dahl's The Witches possesses the theme of misogyny. Overall, I would rate this book about a 4 out of 5. This is one that I also came across when I was a young man, but reading it at 24, I don't think I enjoyed it nearly as much as I did when I would have read it at the age of, 6, 7, or 8. But it's still a really well done book. It's actually one of his more darker children's stories because the boy, who remains nameless throughout the story, stays a mouse. He doesn't turn back into a human as he does in the 1990 film version. So there is something quite dark about that. He even has a conversation with his grandmother, realizing that he's only going to be around for another 8 years, but he's happy that he gets to spend it with his grandmother since she is the only living relative that he has. But he only lives for another 8 years, and he's such a young man. I think he's only about 8 years old when the story begins, and so he's going to die at the age of 16, and he's aware of that. And he's not only going to die, he's going to die as a mouse. He's not even going to die as a human. So this story is very, very dark. I think it's probably the darkest story in the collection that I bought, but overall, I do really enjoy it. I think that it's a really well done story. I think that it's a really cool concept, and I also love the villain. I love the Grand High Witch. I love the illustrations by Quentin Blake. All around, it's a great book. I think it's one of his best, definitely. But I think that I didn't enjoy it as much as I think I did at 8 years old. So that's why it doesn't get a perfect 5 out of 5. It gets a 4 out of 5. But it is still number 2 in this list because I think it's one of the most memorable Roald Dahl stories that I've ever read. And finally, number 1, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. 5 golden tickets are hidden in 5 Wonka bars, each winning a child a chance to take a tour of the mysterious, eccentric Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. Charlie Bucket, a poor but resilient, kind boy, manages to find one of the 5 golden tickets and goes along with his Grandpa Joe to tour the factory. Unfortunately, the other 4 children, Augustus Gloop, Violet Beauregard, Veruca Salt, and Mike TV, are not as nice as Charlie and end up severely deformed from their refusal to abide by Wonka's rules during the tour of the factory. Charlie, rewarded for his high level of character, wins the ultimate grand prize by becoming Wonka's heir and owning the factory in the future. Of course, Wonka allows him and his entire family to move out of their poor living conditions and into the factory at the end of the story. So some major themes running throughout the book include revenge against cruelty once again, magic, the eccentric daring protagonist, and class division. So obviously the revenge against cruelty is kind of a tricky theme in this book because the revenge against the cruel characters are actually children, and the revenge that's set against them is rather cruel in and of itself. You know, Augustus Gloop is sucked up a pipe in the factory, Veruca Salt goes down a garbage chute, Violet Beauregarde is juiced, and Mike TV is made extremely, extremely tall from his encounter with Wonka Vision, or Wonka Television, whatever it's called in the book. These are cruel characters. They're not very likable, and they're not really meant to be likable. And I guess you could say that it's not even so much revenge in this Roald Dahl book, but it's more so kind of almost a punishment, I suppose. I referenced this in another video I did about Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where these characters, in comparison to Charlie Bucket, are quite affluent people, and I believe that they're supposed to represent some of the 7 deadly sins, as some scholars and other readers have pointed out. But these children are punished for their affluence in a way, because their affluence has made them stuck up and spoiled and of poor, weak character in comparison to Charlie Bucket, who is not an affluent person. He comes from a lower class background. So I guess there is a bit of revenge against cruelty because these children are cruel in their character, but it's not so much revenge as it is punishment. So I guess that a proper theme would be punishment against cruelty. The theme of magic is clearly evident based off of Wonka's various inventions, ice cream that never melts. He has everlasting gobstoppers. He has all kinds of different candy and chocolate that is rather unique and magical. And of course, the greatest example of magic in this book would be the great glass elevator scene at the end that literally goes through the ceiling of the factory and lands back at Charlie's house. You have an eccentric protagonist. Willy Wonka is probably the most eccentric character that Roald Dahl has ever written. He is quick-witted, he can be a little testy and short with the kids by telling them to shut up. He has rather bizarre manners, he has a bizarre way of dressing, he has a bizarre way of looking at things, and I think that this eccentricity is certainly highlighted in the 2 film versions of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the one with Gene Wilder and the one with Johnny Depp. So he's a very eccentric protagonist, and I remember actually being Willy Wonka one year for Halloween because he's such an interesting offbeat character, and I think that that's one of the reasons why the book is so memorable, because of Willy Wonka. Class division, as I mentioned in my other video on Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, is also a pretty prominent theme. Once again, you have these 4 affluent children, and then you have Charlie Bucket, who is a lower class status, and they're all put together in the same factory, and Charlie is the one that comes out on top. He's the one that goes from rags to riches. He started with nothing, and now he has everything, whereas these children, they started with everything, and now they have nothing. Although they probably still have everything, but they certainly don't have Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, which Charlie now possesses at the end of the story. Overall, I would rate this book a 5 out of 5. I think that this has to be my #1 favorite Roald Dahl story. It's one of my favorite books of all time. Every time I read it or watch the film version, it always has the same effect on me. It was the story that really made me believe that anything was possible. It totally captured my imagination. I started realizing that reality was only limited by my ability to think outside the box and to believe in the magic of human existence. And this is just one of my all-time favorite stories. I think that it is a really powerful, whimsical, rags to riches story, and I highly recommend it. I think that there's a reason why this is the most famous Roald Dahl story of all time, and honestly, I think it's probably his greatest. No question about that. And finally, here are some honorable mentions that did not make my list. So So that's all the time that we have for today. Be sure to comment below about what you think of my selections and comment what your favorite Roald Dahl books are. Let me know what you think of the themes that I explored. Let me know if I did a good job of summarizing the stories. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you are new to this channel, please click the like button below and subscribe. The Patreon link is also linked below in the description box. Any money that you give me helps me to bring on higher profile guests. It allows me to do deeper dives into the research that I want to explore, and it also allows me to purchase better editing and filming equipment. So any amount helps at all. $7 a month, $6,000 a month, anything at all. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next Friday.